right, this starts our video here on per capita. And before we really get into the per capita piece, we're going to kind of do a little exercise here on ratios and different things using this table. So we have population and homicide deaths. Just one thing to note, the population is in millions, so every one of these numbers has the word million at the end. So keeping that in mind as we work through, we're going to use the data from this table to answer some questions going forward. So let's get rid of these just in case I need to reference. So number one, what is the ratio of Colombia homicides to Mexican homicides? So the key here is that we're talking about homicides, right? So you want to use the right column, and you want to know Colombians come first, so they're going to go on the top, Mexicans on the bottom. So how many homicides were in Colombia? 14,670. How many homicides in Mexico? 26,037. Now it does say to write the ratio two different ways if you're looking at your worksheet. So this is one way we could write it. Now another one is, you know that the fraction bar means division. So if we just divide this, you end up with 0.563 as a decimal, which means to 1. So for every one homicide death in Mexico, because you can see the 1 is on the bottom, corresponds with Mexico, there are 0.563 homicide deaths in Colombia, right? So almost a 2-to-1 ratio, but just not quite. All right, so let's find the ratio of the population. We're looking at number 2 of the U.S. to the Australian population and interpret the meaning. So who comes first? Well, the U.S. So U.S. on top, Australia on the bottom. And now we're talking about population, so get the right column. So in the U.S. we have 318.9 million, and Australia we've got 23.5 million. Since they're both in million, those cancel out, and I've got 318.9 over 23.5. Well, it just is hard to comprehend. So again, if I use this fraction bar as a divisor, and I divide 318.9 divided by 23.5, I get 13.57 over 1. Now, the numerator deals with Americans. So a meaningful sentence or an interpretation, there are 13.57 Americans to every 1 Australian. And that would be a way to interpret, right? So if you see 1 Australian on the street, you're going to see approximately 13.57 Americans, right? If we're talking about just the populations of the world. Number 3, of the country listed, what's the minimum value in deaths? Okay, so we're looking at the homicide deaths column in the middle. Who has the minimum? Well, Australia has the minimum at 254. Who has the maximum? Well, that's Mexico at 26,037. The next question, what is the range? Well, remember the range is max minus the min. So 26,037 from Mexico minus 254 from Australia, and our range is 25,783. So that is the difference between the highest and the lowest values that we're dealing with. Keeping that same concept, number 4, range of populations. Well, who has the biggest population? Well, that's the U.S. at 318.9 million, and the smallest is Australia at 23.5 million. So when I subtract them, I get a range of 295.4 million. So that that's the difference between the highest and the lowest populations. Now, can we make a meaningful comparison in the number of deaths between two countries without taking the populations into consideration? Now, I want to go back to the table for this. Now, can you really say that Mexico is the worst? They have the most homicide deaths, but they also have a lot of people. I mean, I would say the U.S., South Africa, and Colombia also have a lot of deaths, but look at the difference. Ooh, wrong one. Look at the difference in populations, right? The U.S. has just a ton more people, but Colombia and South Africa do not have a lot of people. So I think, no, you can't. You've got to say, well, if you have more people, you're more likely to have homicide deaths, I would think. Especially if you put them all in the same area, right? Conflicts arise and people do crazy things. Now, in number 6, I would say either South Africa or Colombia, because as I mentioned, they have quite a few deaths and they don't have very many people. So it just seems like that would be more likely to have homicide deaths. All right, let's get to some more actual per capita work. Per capita means per person. So the key is, and that per person is per one person. So instead of saying, 385 people eat 275 eggs, well, what does that mean? How many eggs does one person eat, right? We can break data down to be per one person. And the word per implies division. So we're going to divide by people. This is kind of what per capita means, that we're going to divide by the number of people. Okay? So in number 1, there are 400 million M&Ms produced each day. If there are, find the number of M&Ms produced daily per capita. So we're trying to find M&Ms per capita. So that means M&Ms are going to go on the top. Per implies the division bar. Capita implies people. So M&Ms over people. Well, how many M&Ms do we have? 400 million. How many people do we have? 324 million. Okay, well, because they're both million, those cancel out. I'm left with 400 divided by 324. And because we want per capita, we want per one person. So we do want to divide. When I divide those two numbers, I get 1.23 over 1. And remember, M&Ms are on top, people are on the bottom. So when you put this in a meaningful sentence, we would say there are 1.23 M&Ms produced daily per one person, or for every person, or something like that. Okay. Number 2, the Digest of Educational Statistics says in the state of Indiana spent $9.98 billion on K-12 students in the 11-12 school year. If there were 1.04 million K-12 students in Indiana that year, how much did they spend per student? So now we're talking money per student, because students are people. So this is a per capita problem. Okay, so how much money did we spend? 9.98 billion over the 1.04 million. Well, billion and million are not the same, so we need to continue further. So 9.98 billion means times 10 to the 9th. 1.4 million is 10 to the 6th. So when I divide, I get 9.6 times 10 to the 9 minus 6 is 3. We're talking about money, so we change this to standard form, and that means the state of Indiana spent $9,600 per student. And you might be thinking, well, how does that compare with people around us? Well, let's look at number 3 in the state of Illinois, where they spent $25.01 billion for their 2.08 million students. How much did they spend per capita? Spend money over people. So they spent $25.01 billion for their 2.08 million. All right, again, let's change this. Now, billion we know means 9, but I want to move this over, so 10. So 2.501 times 10 to the 10th, because billion plus I moved it once, over the 2.08 million means 6. So when I divide 2.501 divided by 2.08, I get 1.20 times 10 to the 10 minus 6 is 4. Let's move that to standard form by moving my decimal to the right 4 places, because it's positive, so 1, 2, 3, 4. And the state of Illinois spends $12,000 per student. So you can see in the comparison, Illinois spends $2,400 more per student. And I got that by taking $12,000 for Illinois minus the $9,600 for Indiana for a difference of $2,400 per student. This is a per student. You can look at just overall, Illinois spends approximately $15 billion more, but they also have, an extra million students. So you can't just take into account that they spend more money, because they also have more students. So when you go by breaking it down by per student, then you can do a more meaningful comparison.